Hi, how you doing? Welcome to the next episode, episode 5, which is all about surviving an admission into a psychiatric ward. If that has happened to you, or if you know someone who's going through that, some of this stuff might be able to help them in terms of how it works and how to survive it. So, after my major nervous breakdown in 1995, I got sectioned. I got a Section 3, which is a 28-day order to be held under the Mental Health Act of 1983. The reason for that was that I was extremely unsettled when I went in there, but also suffered quite a lot of heavy psychosis where they weren't sure whether I was going to be a kind of a threat to myself or a threat to other people. So that was the reason why they decided to do it. So let's go through it step by step. First of all, it's the first stage is about orientation. Now, entering a ward, if you've never been in the psychiatric ward before, literally as the doors open, there's a buzz noise. This buzzer is there to alert the staff that work there, of people entering and leaving the ward, because obviously it's quite important from a security point of view to know who's there and who isn't. The fact that that happens, the feeling that you get when you go in is that it's a little bit like going into a prison, when they kind of buzz noise before they close the gates. I think a lot of people would agree with me with this. When you're disorientated as you are after having a breakdown, it's very difficult to get your head around what's actually happening to you. So I was lucky that in the hospital where I was put into, which was Westmoreland General in Kendal, the ward there was called Ward 4. I was lucky that my mum worked at the time in the X-ray department, so she was physically on site all the time. So I got a lot of visits from my mum, which helped immensely in those early stages. I was very nervous about my rights because of all this business about the safety of me and the safety of others. I mean, I'd never been violent in my entire life. I didn't have a history of it. Never felt that way before. Quite an introverted character in general, but because of the mania, I was obviously coming across in a certain way that they needed to have an element of control and keep an eye on me from a monitoring perspective for the safety of myself and for the safety of others. But again, as I say, doesn't feel very nice. Makes you feel a bit like you're a lion in a cage. Like they're putting baby reins on you, or like you're a dog and they're putting a lead on you. There's a huge, massive climb down in your brain about not just like class, but your position as a human being, what that actually means, and that's never come into question before in your life before you've been in this position. So you need to get oriented about the nurses, who they are. You need to. I felt I needed to have clearly positioned badges because some of them had them wonky, and at the time I was so sensitive and paranoid about things. I didn't know whether someone was a person who was on the ward, like a sufferer or a patient. I couldn't really tell whether they'd taken the badge from someone else and were wearing it as a joke. Obviously, I wasn't in the greatest mental state at the time, but I felt I needed to have these badges clearly labelled so I could understand the difference between the staff and the patients. There's the psychiatrists. You've got to get to know who they are, and they're quite, or in my time, they were quite shrouded and protected through this level of staffing of the nurses that are on the ward, so you didn't get to meet them that often. Then there's what I refer to as the inmates, because it felt like prison. I don't feel like that now, but obviously at the time, that's how I felt. I counted 16 inmates at the time, and they were of all shapes and sizes, different people from different classes, sexes, diverse backgrounds, diverse ethnicities, all sorts of different people from all walks of life were in there. Some people, probably in the same way that I appeared, were quite intimidating at times, and I felt like in the early stages that I needed to move away from those people because they made me feel uncomfortable, because I felt like there was a potential threat of violence. There was one kid who was very much like me. His name was Daniel. He'd been taking some form of recreational drug, and it turned out in London, similarly to how I was. But the effect of, I don't know what it was, whether it was LSD or some kind of mind-altering substance, that he hadn't come off the trip. It seemed to be like an everlasting stasis where he would just shuffle up and down the ward. The ward was like L-shaped, and so a lot of bedrooms were up one end, and then down the other end was kitchens and lounges and these kind of relaxation rooms where you could go. And I used to watch Daniel shuffling up and down that corridor, and then just touching the exit door, and then walking up to the far end, which was another door that went into kind of a mindfulness area where you could do meditation, but it was always locked. You would only get through there if a nurse would unlock the door. And it was so sad to see him going backwards and forwards all day long and shuffling. Sometimes I used to shuffle by the side of him, try and keep him company. He wasn't talkative. He wasn't coming out of his bubble. Felt so sorry for him. I mean, even his skin was kind of grey looking. I don't know what had happened to him, but it was pretty traumatic. I hope he's okay to this day. I really do. Living in close proximity to these people is difficult. You have to share the rooms, you have to share the kitchen when you're making a cup of tea, all that sort of stuff. It's you really have to get used to being in that community. Then there's the cleaners. The cleaners come in twice a day, or they come in first thing in the morning. They mop all the floors. Obviously, there's a health and safety thing about everything being clean. And even though they're not per se qualified as nurses, they do tend to get involved in a lot of the day-to-day stuff, and eventually they sort of became my friend and helped me out of my shell, even though they weren't necessarily qualified counsellors. One of them was called Josie, and she was brilliant. White-haired old lady, loads of fun. What else? The ward round. So when out every day, a trolley would come out with a wooden top on it, and one of the nurses or the head nurses would open it up, and inside it was a whole set of drugs. And within those boxes, the white boxes that were in there, they would distribute the drugs to each person. You'd have to get in a queue or have your name called out, and you go up to this wooden box. The lady gives you a little pill or whatever it is that you're supposed to take, and a little cup of water, and you drink that. Or there's some kind of liquid antipsychotic that you drink, and that's another way you could take your medicine instead of taking a pill, and that's quite strange at the beginning as well to get used to that. So this orientation stage, I had to learn how to conduct myself in amongst this community of people. There was a lot of waiting around all the time. I didn't know how to relax because obviously I'd been hypomanic and really busy doing a lot of stuff at uni. I got very embarrassed with visitors. My mum used to line up different friends, guys from the football team or ex-colleagues from work would come to visit, and it was quite toe-curling, to be honest. I kind of accepted that it had to happen, but in a sense, if I'd have had my own way, I wouldn't have had anybody seeing me at that time, but maybe it did me some good. I don't know. I just feel like in general, when people see you when you're not so well, they always remember you in that state. They never seem to be able to get that thing out of their head, and in the future they always just seem to remember you being in a strange place with strange people, and therefore you get tarnished by a particular brush. I wasn't allowed to make phone calls at the beginning during this orientation stage, and I had to hand in my driver's license as well with the DVLA in Swansea and tell them what had happened, and that was a nightmare. That was another part of my liberty that went missing. The next stage, I kind of started going into my own shell. I had massive shyness. I couldn't come to terms with what had happened. I had loads of regret. I felt sorry. I had paranoia all the time, thinking that everybody's making fun of me, and it's so debilitating. It's awful to have that going on in your mind, and it does seem so real, but it's just not the truth. But that people are not doing that. These people there are trying to care for you and look after you and get you back on your feet, but it's the mind. The mind is playing the tricks. Coming to terms with it is kind of like the next stage. It's a bit like coming out of a coma. I did a lot of crying with my mum, where we discussed there's no right and there's no wrong, and what's happened I shouldn't be blamed for it. I was really sensitive to coincidences, and I had this physical concern about chewing and swallowing like I was going to choke, and yeah, it was awful. It's one of those things where you've had such a shock that you are constantly monitoring your own body, like your heart rate, and making sure that you're protected. And when you're chewing things and swallowing them, there's obviously this threat that it would get lodged in your throat. So the paranoia doesn't help in respect to that. The law, this whole idea of being sectioned under a mental health act, it's even though you're saying there's no right or wrong, you're talking about the whole truth and nothing but the truth, and so help me God and all this stuff. You start to realize the gravity of the situation and the fear in terms of your human rights, that if you're not careful, you could end up being in there forever, and that's not a great thought. I constantly felt like my life was in their hands, and that there was a certain pressure involved with that. I used to constantly say, I'm like an egg, and you're putting me inside a microwave oven and I'm going to explode, and all that sort of stuff. Again, pretty unwarranted, but at the time feels really real to yourself. That said, after a while, when you do start to come to terms with where you are and what you're doing, you get into a routine, you get comfortable, everything seems to be a little bit too easy. you have all this space and time to think, which is exactly what the ward is there for, because that's what you need. You start seeing fun in it. You start making friends with some of these other inmates, which is good, to start making those connections. You start to feel normal again, and I know there's no such thing as normal, but this idea that you first of all rejected the place because you felt abnormal means that starting to feel normal is a good sign of progress. There are side effects. My mouth got really salty and dry with the antipsychotics. I got thrush on my tongue, which was horrendous. So then on ward rounds, when the medication comes out, you then have to have a thrush medication in your mouth as well, like a wash, as on top of all the other stuff that you have to take. So it's just another thing to worry about that's happening to you that you didn't ask for, which is kind of, tough. I tended to keep tidying things in my room because I had all this extra time. I was kind of moving things around because I had so much time and space on my mind. I started to gamify things. I would move stuff around to play little games with myself, a little bit like OCD, flicking the light switch on and off, or moving my deodorant on a table and things like that. Also, numerology was getting into my head at these times where I'm analysing the time, the numbered channels on the TV, or, all sorts of things where I'm looking at numbers to find meaning in it. Daily routines. I'd be waking up at 5:30, pretty much every day in this early stages, which was annoying because I kind of wanted to sleep in. A lot of the time it was from an old lady called Florence in the toilet next to me. She would wake me up with all the noise. There'd be workmen outside, obviously not at 5:30, but when it got nearer to 9 a.m, there'd be workmen, because it was a new hospital. They were either doing some sort of development outside. You'd have many cups of tea, loads of toast, like all day long, sipping tea and eating biscuits and toast. And then I started to smoke, and I started getting into cigarettes. I'd take a trip to when I was allowed off the ward, when I got some of my privileges back, I could go to the supermarket, mainly for cigarettes, but to get chocolate bars and other stuff. I started planning my meals. Meal times were difficult and were peculiar, and I would feel embarrassed because the way some people eat when they're not very well is they haven't got the P's and Q's, or whatever you want to refer to it as. It's quite a mess, and again, that was quite intimidating to sit around all these people at meal times, on the same tables, just before the ward round came out. I'd be constantly asking what was coming up on TV, or trying to get the Radio Times or the CFAX or whatever it was at the time. I'd watch the same news channels, the newscast I'd see 10 times a day, so I'd know what was coming up. Next stage moving into after that is sort of coping mechanisms. I started keeping a notebook because one of the nurses said that it would help, and it did. And I think you should do that too if you're not doing that already, because looking back, that's literally my notebook from 1995. Looking back on that stuff, it does really help throughout the years afterwards, once you've kept that notebook. I started looking to faith and religion. I'd be asking, why am I here? Asking what God was, all that sort of stuff. The smoking became such a big thing. They had a smoking room. I'd be in the smoking room, I don't know, 3 times in the morning, 4 times in the afternoon, and 5 times in the evening. Or I'd go for a walk and have a cigarette outside. I mean, I was smoking 10, 15, possibly 20 cigarettes a day. You start to count the days because everything's going so slow. You feel like you're getting better, and you start to feel that this place isn't too bad. Then you start to move into the next stage, which is progress. The monitoring is still there, but you're kind of now starting to be able to monitor yourself. You get to a stage where I was feeling 100%, but I was getting panic attacks when I felt under pressure, or if I saw authority, someone with a badge or a psychiatrist would make me feel nervous. I would say, I got myself up to what I referred to as 95%, and that I was holding steady. That this would go up and down, because sometimes I would regress, sometimes I'd feel like I got back to square one. I was still doing college work at this time because I felt like I was going to go back, but really, in hindsight, I was never going to go back. I was never going to be able to go back, even though a Section 3 order is 28 days, so it would have been 4 weeks, and then going straight back to Harrow after that. I don't think, I clearly couldn't have handled it. Needed more time. If I did too much in the daytime, I would become exhausted and have to go to bed early. Ward round meetings, like the big serious ones where the lawyers were there, I would have questions for this committee. It was quite intimidating because there were people in suits who you didn't know who they were. Didn't know who the psychiatrist was out of those people because everybody was wearing smart clothes, and you're on your own. It feels like you versus 6 people. It's, again, I don't know if that could be improved or if it has been improved over the last 20 years, but for me it was quite intimidating. My questions were always about drugs. Would I get physio? Why was I taking medication? I even asked things like, can I drink alcohol, which was pretty stupid. What were their plans for me? What was my diagnosis? How was I doing between 1 and 100? Can I try a visit home and stay overnight and try and get off the ward? This is this kind of phasing out of the care and showing them that you're getting a bit more responsible to be able to handle that. Again, names, faces, badges, titles. I was always trying to be on top of that to know who was who and what was what. Cutting down my drugs, that was another question, because I was always worried about getting hooked. You say people get hooked on painkillers. I'd never taken any of these drugs before. I'd never taken any. I took recreational drugs, but I never took anything like psychiatric drugs before, and I was very concerned about what that meant to me moving forwards. Then the next stage is getting into home visits, testing my responsibility to get more privileges to stay away. I wanted to go to my Royal College of Art interview. I was down for the computer-related design course, and I wanted to do that. I managed to convince them that I could do that, and that was pretty much one of the stupidest things I've done. But I was so heartbroken that I didn't want to miss it. And then when I turned up, the tutor, the professor, she sent me a letter afterwards saying, you were clearly not well. Portfolio was good enough, but clearly not well, so I wasn't going to get in the intake that year. So that was another thing to be devastated about. I wanted to go back to Harrow, and I did for a little while, and again that was a massive mistake because by that point Tanya was clearly, going out with Gideon, and a lot had changed, and I just ended up spending 3 days in bed in the flat on my own again, which brought back a lot of bad memories. So that was a total mistake, and I shouldn't have done it. I wanted to go for a swim at the leisure centre, so I was asking for things like that. I wanted to do a bit of weight training because I'd lost so much weight. I was like 10 stone wet, and I wanted to try and put some weight back on. I wanted to play football, which they duly did. They set up a game with some doctors that knew my mum, and that was great. That was exactly what I needed. I wanted to go out for a haircut. I wanted to start looking after my appearance and myself. I wanted my bank account to be unfrozen. I mean, my mum and dad had taken control of, from a legal standpoint, all my, personal artifacts, or whatever you want to refer to it as, my business. And they'd got permission from the bank to be in control of that, but I wanted to get that back. I wanted to catch a bus into Kendal, wanted to just walk around the shops, little things like that, which have been kind of taken away, and you've been stuck in this facility for weeks and weeks and weeks, and you just want to get out, get your life back. There were relaxation rooms. There were books. I started reading poems on the Black Death, or whatever, the depression and things like that. There was a keyboard in there so you could play the piano. There were board games, Scrabble, newspapers, that sort of thing. But what I wanted to do was take something out of the diary to finish off with. It's this exhaustion poem, and I can't remember exactly where I got it from, but it's really apt, and I wanted to share it now. Exhaustion. I'm tired from the inside out. My spirit craves for crumbs of comfort anywhere. A body lost at sea, I sink in hopeless search for your attention. I'm almost proud of my exhaustion. I wear it like a medal to prove he tried. But now's the time to say I quit and let the pain begin. Fatigue and pain must fade away, though ticking minutes of my alarm. And only then will I become more than I was before all this happened. Fantastic. So, to finish off really quickly, the stages are, as you go in, disbelief, realization, loss of liberty, acclimatizing to your surroundings, learning the community, rules of engagement, the ropes. Then you feel regret and sorrow, the sensitivity and rawness. You're decompressing, you're becoming accustomed, then the drugs and the side effects, dealing with time and learning to be bored, filling the time in your routine, getting some structure back, learning to cope, getting coping hacks to kind of find your way through. This is the best coping hack that you can get. Standing on your own 2 feet, facing a ward round committee, that's all about courage and bravery, and you've got to do that. You've got to stand up for that. Getting your rights back as a result, learning to be responsible as a citizen again, getting your life back, and then just repeat until they let you go because of good behaviour. And that's it. I know it's been another long one, and I apologise, but thanks for listening. I hope this has helped. Leave me some comments. It'd be great to get some feedback about what you think. But take care. I wish you all the best, and I'll see you soon. Bye-bye.